with the latest information and analysis of major events from around the world. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
Jordan Ditloff is a law graduate and works for the Free Speech Union of Australia. Formerly Federal Secretary of the Libertarian Party, Jordan worked to help guide the party through the challenges of constitutional and structural reform and the adoption of its new party name. Jordan maintains a keen interest in policy and in legislation before Parliament. We're going to talk to Jordan today about the galloping censorship being witnessed across the West, in the UK, across the EU, in the US, Canada, and of course, Australia. Clearly, our governments are in retreat, and the dismantlement of free speech and other key principles of democracy are necessary to bolster incumbency. Strong oppositions and a free and questioning media are hard to find. Jordan, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mike. I always think when you give these introductions, it'd be great if I got to come here and talk to you about sunshine and puppies and, better things happening in the world. I feel like a bit of a harbinger of doom, but it's good to see you and your audience nonetheless.
Yeah, we used to describe, people say, they say to me, what do you do? I said, I run a death and destruction outfit, because that's what we report on, death and destruction, which it was in the days of COVID. Not a whole lot's changed though. The censorship and control of the internet and stuff have become quite paramount and quite strong. Why do you think? I know why they're doing it, but why do you think they have this desire? As our shadow minister for communications in Australia, who's a liberal, but said government has to control the internet. Why do you think government needs to control the internet globally?
Well, when we say government, what we really mean is the major party establishment. So that's one of two wings of the same bird are going to be in power across most of the West at this time, with a few exceptions. But really, what they're afraid of is they and their mainstream media allies, collaborators, whatever we want to call it, losing control of the narrative, and that is their biggest fear, because that control of that narrative has historically shored up their position and meant that they can control or manipulate what people think about issues, what issues are getting discussed, and try to sort of, control the flow of the river of information. And in the modern day, in the internet age, where you've got many very fine alternate media outlets like yourself, people like Topher Field, Rebel News, and many others, you've got this sort of increasingly loud and increasingly large, as Jason said, when Karl Stefanovic is doing a podcast of his own one-on-one with Pauline Hanson, you sort of know which direction the wind is blowing. And what you see with a lot of these censorship things, it's often two-pronged. There's an attempt to control or burden digital platforms, who they know are often the gatekeepers of information and of new media. So platforms like X, platforms like YouTube. I imagine there's a reason you guys sort of host and broadcast your services from your own platform, not natively from any of the things I've just mentioned. And that's very wise, because they're using that sort of gateway status of digital providers to target them for regulation and fines. They're often not targeting you, as in the World Today News, or me, as someone with a YouTube channel, sort of promoting alternative information. They're targeting the platform. So that's the first kind of prong they're using. And then often what you'll see, which frequently comes up kind of beneath the surface or less often noticed, is, and the good example of this is the misinformation, disinformation bill that failed to pass in late 2024. You see this attempt to essentially shore up and run a protection racket for the mainstream media. So the misinformation, disinformation bill would have seen a carve-out or exemption for misinformation and disinformation provisions for the mainstream media, because they're supposedly, more reliable, more accurate, and more adhering to journalistic standards. And of course, I can't say that with a straight face. I imagine you, as a fellow exile or refugee, whatever you want to call it, from mainstream media once upon a time, would similarly struggle to say that with a straight face. And so you have this two-pronged approach to censorship, where it's both trying to limit and control the new media, and it's trying to prop up and protect the old media, because they know that the old media's business model is fundamentally doomed and will fail in the long run. So they're trying to do anything they can to sort of maintain this artificial playing field, and using that two-pronged approach to do so.
Do you think, I mean, everyone's talking about in Australia, Karl Stefanovic, the morning guy from Channel 9, doing his own podcast, and he has these interesting people on, very much like I think John Anderson does something called Conversation. Karl's numbers aren't that great. They are not that great on YouTube. Now, that's not surprising because YouTube can doctor the numbers if they want to. But the warning sign is we are ramping up for something. I don't know what it is, but you don't have all the countries in the world, or most of them, going hell for leather with censorship. There's something happening. And it's, often talk about 2030. I don't know if that's the case, but they are all lockstep now, and they're going to become quite a problem for those with free speech. But however, having said that, people will get away with it. If you have mainstream media under the guise of, say, Karl Stefanovic, and he could be quite innocent. But having said that, if you get mainstream media into the domain of those that enjoy independent media, then you can again start using not blatant government wishes, but you can use nudging. And nudging is a little bit of this and a bit of that, and you move people across to the narrative or to the thought process collectively that government wants. So do you think the intrusion of legacy media into a domain pretending to be the Australian version of Joe Rogan, trying to get that audience to start following this particular person, and then he does his nudging, do you think that's a warning sign, or am I just being a bit paranoid?
Well, look, just because you might be a bit paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you, and I can say that from personal experience.
Oh, yeah.
They're not always mutually exclusive statements. But the reason I was smiling as you were talking is I have a bit of a theory about Karl Stefanovic, that he's kind of a legitimate investigative journalist trapped in the body of a buffoon on these morning shows. And the reason I know that, or the reason I suspect that, is because they do a sort of a morning after the budget with the Treasurer every year. And every year, the Today Show with Karl Stefanovic interview of Jim Chalmers has been my favourite interview to anticipate, because every year Jim Chalmers thinks it's going to be this softball, easy interview. And this year, it might have been the last year, Karl Stefanovic said, Treasurer, how does it feel to deliver your last budget surplus? and I just thought that was the most fantastic, because the look on Jim Chalmers' face, like you could have seen the blood drain from his face. He sort of had this stupid shit-eating grin as he does, and it just, fled from him in abject terror. But so my sort of suspicions about Karl aside, I think that what you're seeing is mainstream media and people who are influential within mainstream media, they can see the same things we can see about trends. They know which way the wind is blowing. And through a mix of their own personal ambition and the sort of desires of the mainstream sort of corporate media masters, of course, they want to follow suit. They want to try to sort of latch onto the trend and be a bit parasitic in that way. They don't want to be the forerunners taking risks and doing scary things when a platform is new. They want to jump on the bandwagon once all the risk has gone. But the beauty of alternative media and digital media news platforms is that they are very much merit-based. They're very much community-based. You can't, whether it be through YouTube's algorithm or whether it be through algorithms on X and others, which reward engagement, which reward early interactions, resharing, replying to comments, all this sort of stuff. These are things that the mainstream media just aren't very good at. And, they can try all they like to recreate the success of things like the Joe Rogan podcast. But we've got to remember is Joe Rogan was not Joe Rogan for the first 10 years of his podcast. It took him a huge amount of time, a huge amount of building up a genuine engagement and a sort of a level of trust with his audience that is very, very difficult to replicate overnight, no matter how many resources you pump into it. I think someone like Tucker Carlson's a great example of that, where he now regularly does numbers that are far in excess of his former employer, Fox News. And I think that these platforms and these alternative models of media are very democratic in a way that, the Murdoch press, in a way that Fairfax papers, all these sorts of entities really hate, because they don't like merit-based democratic communication or information flow, and they'd much rather have a privileged, protected position. So I think there's that. I think that there certainly is a coordinated effort around the world from entities like the WEF and others. And again, I think that's as simple as, I say that the best antidote to conspiracy thinking is to meet as many politicians and bureaucrats as possible, because once you meet and become familiar with these people, you realize that they are not only not exceptional or, the best of us, they're often very mediocre or even less competent than the middle of us. So, but it is true that these kind of networks of influence have been very used to being able to dominate and control and manipulate the flow of information, and they are absolutely not responding to the challenges that are coming their way without an effort to fight back. So what you're seeing is the system that has been in existence, status quo, basically pushing back and trying to fight the tide. But fortunately, as difficult as it might be and as rarely as it might seem like that from us in it, looking at it, I think that our side, the side of free speech, the side of uncensored news, of democratic flow of information, you can't beat the signal. In the long run, no matter how much, and sometimes, especially when the government cracks down and tries to control these things, you will see the uncensored, more free speech-oriented approach prevail.
And just quickly, because we are running out of time, sorry about the short time, but I sometimes get a bit of a waffle on and I just keep talking to the previous guest. I will get slapped down for that, and I can't wait. Just quickly, though, your thoughts on the... I thought Susan Lee was drab, or Lay. I look at Angus Taylor, and I look at Jane Hume, who's an ex-Turnbull fan. Do you think much has changed, or is it just all smoke and mirrors?
Well, look, I'm very much on the record on this show and in many other instances of being very, very fatigued and critical of the Liberal Party. And, I often say that I think of the Libs like an ex that I sort of still want to see doing well. I don't have any grudge against them. You see them at a party and they're making bad decisions and getting drunk and, fraternising with bad people and making bad life choices, and you just cringe. That's how I feel about the Liberal Party a little bit most days. But I think we should also, we've asked for change. We were very unhappy with Susan Ley. The Australian people really weren't impressed with her, and One Nation's polling surged as a result. They've listened to that, for better or worse, better late than never. And I think we should wait and see what they do rather than what they say. Taylor's come out with some sort of heartening messaging in terms of cutting both taxes and spending, talking about restoring sensible people to front bench positions, and that's from both the left and the right. Talking about bringing Jacinta Price back, bringing Andrew Hastie into sort of a more domestic economic portfolio. And also, notably, I would say Tim Wilson potentially as shadow treasurer. Angus Taylor was treasurer in the Dutton opposition, and he really didn't manage to lay a glove on Chalmers, which I think, as you say, doesn't fill me with huge confidence in him as leader. But you do need someone, if you're going to have a leader who's a bit more steady as she goes and sort of reasonable everyman, which I think Taylor is more that than, say, a Keating or a Costello, you need someone in that attack dog role in the Treasury. And I think that Tim Wilson, for all that we disagree on some issues, I think he would be very good in that role. So, I think that we may well see a real sort of resurgence from a very, very low base with the Libs. Like, I think a lot of people really just didn't like Susan Ley, and some of One Nation's surge in support has been that. So I think we will see that sort of come back down, and we will see the Libs kind of bounce back a little bit in the polls. What they can do with that and what they actually deliver versus what they simply talk about, we'll have to wait and see.
Jordan Ditloff, always a pleasure. If somebody wants to find out more about what you do or how to get in contact with you, how do they do that? So
all of my socials, I'm on YouTube, X, Instagram and Facebook. I'm at Ditloff, the number 4 cents. So at Ditloff, 2 T's, 2 F's, 4 cents. And I'd love to hear from you on all the issues we've talked about and more on my other channels.
We're today's News Talk, the world today.